our next topics, which are identifying a reimbursable meal, offer versus serve, and point of service meal counting. Next slide. So, a requirement from USDA is that signage must be displayed at or near the beginning of the serving line for both breakfast and lunch. The purpose of this required signage is to assist students in identifying the components of a reimbursable meal. So if you are serving breakfast, you need breakfast signage. If you're serving lunch, you need lunch signage. And lots of things happen over summer break. And so now is the time to be ensuring that your posters are still intact and available for students to view when school starts. So next slide. So if something has happened over the summer with painting walls or repair, you will want to ensure that you have signage for when school starts. And signage can be ordered from the Nutrition Services homepage. And on the slide, you will see that you would go to Nutrition Services Home and then Material Order Form. So this is the location where you could order your signage, as well as if you need the non-discrimination poster, the And Justice for All, you can go to this location to order both of those items. And we'll be talking about civil rights a little bit later in today's presentation. But ensure that your signage is visible to students. Let's go to the next slide and talk about offer versus serve. Now, yesterday we talked about the food components that are required for breakfast and lunch and the required portion sizes that must be offered to students. Today, we are going to be talking about a serving option that is available to schools. And the purpose of that serving option, offer versus serve, it is to allow students to decline food items. The goal is to minimize plate waste, encourage schools to offer choices, and of course, if students are able to turn down food items that they do not intend on eating, that should improve customer satisfaction. So in your handout packet, we have information about offer versus serve and how it operates in schools. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about the basics. The basics of offer versus serve require that all food components in the required portion sizes be offered to students. So you are planning your menus with all of the required components in the required portion sizes. The meal must be priced as a unit. So there's no discount if a student does not take all of the 5 food components at breakfast, or I'm sorry, at lunch. The student decides which items to decline. So it's up to the student to make that decision if they do not want a food component. And schools cannot require a student to take an entree and or milk. And that's a frequent question we often receive is, well, they have to take milk. They have to take the entree. If you're a school implementing offer versus serve, it is the the student's decision of what food components that they will be taking for the reimbursable meal. You can encourage students to take their milk. You can encourage students to take the entree, but you cannot require them. So next slide. So the student must select under offer versus serve for a reimbursable lunch. It must contain at least 3 different components. One must be at least a half a cup of fruit, vegetable, or a combination of the two to equal that half cup requirement. So for lunch, a reimbursable lunch meal could be as simple as a cheeseburger on a bun, because I have my grain and I have my meat component, and a half a cup of green beans or a half a cup of fruit vegetable from my multi-day food bar, my fruit vegetable bar. A reimbursable breakfast must contain at least 3 food items. One must be at least a half a cup of fruit or veggie if substituting. So once again, I'm looking for that half a cup of fruit or veggie on that tray and 2 other food items. So that could be as simple as a carton of milk, a bowl pack cereal that contributes 1 ounce equivalent of grain, and my half cup juice. That is a reimbursable breakfast. Moving on to the next slide. As we've already discussed, students are charged the full price for the meal, whether it contains 3, 4, or all 5 components. The cashier must be able to recognize a reimbursable meal. I often say that during an administrative review, one of the most important people is the cashier, because the cashier is identifying that the student is present and that the student has the reimbursable meal that is being counted and claimed for reimbursement. So the cashier must be able to identify what constitutes a reimbursable meal. Now, if the student does not have 3 components, then they should be asked to select more. That could be asking them to return to the fruit vegetable bar if they do not have a half a cup of fruit or vegetable on their tray. Now, they cannot be counted until that student has returned to the bar and come back through for that cashier to identify that they do have a reimbursable meal. Now, some schools have whole pieces of fruits at the cashiering station, like apples, oranges, bananas, and then they can offer that student those whole pieces of fruit to avoid having them have to go back to a fruit vegetable bar and come back through the line. That seems to work very well. The responsibility is that the student has to leave the line with those 3 components, and one of those being a half a cup of fruit or vegetable. Now, the student doesn't have to eat what they take after they leave the line, but they must have the 3 components on their tray for the meal to be counted for reimbursement. Now, those situations where perhaps maybe it's a high school or middle school, elementary, if a student refuses to go back and get that additional component, then the meal cannot be claimed for reimbursement, and the student must be charged a la carte pricing for the food items taken. So if they refuse, then a la carte pricing for what they do have on their tray cannot claim the meal for reimbursement. Next slide. Offer versus serve at lunch is mandatory for high school. It is optional for all other grades. So for K through 8, it is optional. We certainly encourage it because we do not want to see students take food items that they do not intend on eating. In the absence of offer versus serve, then all trays must contain all 5 food components and their required portion sizes. Now, if we think about maybe a kindergartner, first grader, second grader, if we remember from our training yesterday in part 1, we're talking about the required daily portion size for vegetable is 3/4 cup. For fruit, it is a 1/2 cup. And if we're planning to meet the weekly requirements for meat and for grains, it could be 2 ounces of meat alternate and 2 ounce equivalent of grains. That is a substantial amount of food on a tray. So that is why we encourage offer versus serve for all grades. Once again, at lunch, students must select at a minimum at least a 1/2 cup of fruit and or vegetable. They may decline up to 2 components. So can you see why that cashier is so important, that they actually have to be able to look at that tray and determine that student has a reimbursable meal? So they are looking for at least that 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable and 2 other components at lunch. They would need to know some of those things we learned yesterday. And one of those is that the green leafy credits at 1/2 the volume. So if the student only has the green leafy vegetable on their tray, then that cashier would be looking for at least 1 cup serving of the green leafy, which would be equivalent to the 1/2 cup vegetable requirement. So let's move on to offer versus serve at breakfast. Required to offer a minimum of the 3 required components. And if we remember from yesterday, those required components are the 1 cup requirement of fruit/juice. The other component would be our grain or our meat alternate, and our milk. And remember, we can serve vegetables in place of our fruit at breakfast. So our required 3 components. With offer versus serve, you must offer 4 food items. The student may decline 1 item, but must take at a minimum a 1/2 cup of fruit, juice, or vegetable. So that must be on their tray. Offer versus serve is optional for all grade groups, but once again, we encourage it to avoid plate waste and increase student satisfaction. Next slide. Schools that do not implement offer versus serve, so perhaps in elementary, all students must leave the serving line with all food component items for breakfast and the required portion size. And we've already discussed how that can appear to be a lot of food on a tray, especially for a younger student. We encourage offer versus serve for all grades at schools. Next slide. Now, I've already talked about how important that cashier is, or that point of service person, because once again, that is defined as that point in the serving line where it can be accurately determined a reimbursable meal has been taken by a student. So that cashier is very important and needs to understand they are the one determining that that student has a reimbursable meal. In your handout packet, after the offer versus serve, we have information about counting meals, and it discusses the point of service meal count. This is a good reference to share if your staff, food service staff, is not conducting the point of service meal count or manning the cashiering stations, because it goes through the importance of that, and it also goes through why that point of service meal count must be taken after all food components are offered, and what are unacceptable ways of taking the daily meal count. So let's move to the next slide. The meal count must be taken at the end of the serving line or at a location after all food components have been offered. So it must be taken after fruit and vegetable bars, after milk has been offered. It must be at the end of the fruit and veggie bar or food lines. If you have condiments, condiments are not food components, and so those can be offered after the point of service meal count. In fact, I would encourage you to move them away from the cashiering station to avoid any bottlenecks. But it just make sure that your point of service meal count is taken after all food components have been offered. And this would also apply if meals are taken to classrooms, that a morning count is not the same as a point of service meal count. A lot can happen from a morning count until the food is actually in front of the student. And so if meals are being taken to classrooms, they must be counted after the student has received the reimbursable meal. So a roster must accompany meals that are taken to classrooms. So that might apply to in-school suspension or alternative classrooms. When we talk about pre-K meal pattern and where pre-K eat, that would also include those classrooms if pre-K is eating in the classroom. So an accurate point of service meal count is being taken. Next slide. In your handout packet, we have various resources about offer versus serve and point of service meal counting. And these are very good resources to be shared with the point of service meal count cashier so that they understand the importance of their job, and also the whys behind of where that count needs to be taken and identifying reimbursable meals. USDA has a great publication on offer versus serve that goes through various scenarios and of the different food components, and I would encourage you to download that manual and refer to it, maybe send it to your POS cashiering Can you see how important it would be for the food service director to be in communication with that cashier prior to meal service, to identify how food items contribute? So if it's an entree item, making sure that the POS person understands that that's two food components, that if it's a hamburger on a bun, that it counts for the grain and the meat alternate, and the student would only need to have that half a cup at a minimum of fruit vegetable on their tray for that reimbursable meal to be counted. So communication is utmost important to make sure that if you have non-food service staff conducting your POS, that they understand how food items on that day contribute to meeting meal pattern. Next slide. USDA also has some great tip sheets on offer versus serve that are available. So we are going to move on to our next topic, which is providing meals for preschoolers in the school meals program. Now, preschool has become almost very commonplace in schools. Probably the majority of schools have a pre-K program, and pre-K programs operate differently in each school district. Some schools have AM, PM pre-K, some have all-day pre-K, some have a combination of both, half-day pre-K and full-day pre-K. But there are some important things to know if you are providing meals to pre-K students, which we're going to discuss next. So let's move to the next slide. So there are two different meal patterns for pre-K. There is the school meals pattern based on a child's grade group, and for pre-K, they would be following the meal pattern for K through 5. And then there is also the Child and Adult Care Food Program. And the acronym for that program is the CACFP. And with that meal pattern, the portions are based on a child's age. And there's two different age groups that would affect pre-K. There's ages 1 through 2 and ages 3 through 5. Ages 1 through 2 would be early child education. Ages 3 through 5 would be what we typically see for a pre-K program. And so in your handout packet, after the offer versus serve, we're going to find the Child and Adult Care Food Program meal pattern for pre-K. Now, you may be wondering, well, which meal pattern do I use? Allie, would you go to the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Which meal pattern? Well, it all depends on where and when the children eat. Now, for the school breakfast program and the National School Lunch Program meal pattern, these can be followed when preschoolers are served in the cafeteria at the same time as other students. So this is called co-mingling. And let me define co-mingling a little bit better for you. Co-mingling is when, as a server, I cannot distinguish if that is a pre-K student, a kindergarten student, a first grade student, second grade student. They are co-mingled and coming through the line all at the same time. So as a server, it would be difficult for me to change my serving utensils to accommodate a pre-K student and then change back immediately to serve a K through 5 student. That is commingling. Now, if pre-K come in to the serving area, all in a group led by adults, and they proceed through the line, they are not commingled. They are not commingled. They are coming in as a separate class. So that would not be commingled. It's only if, as a server, I cannot identify if that is a pre-K student, first grade student, that would require me to change my serving utensils. Now, if they are not commingled, then the CACFP, the Child and Adult Care Food Program meal pattern, must be followed. When preschool meals are served in the classroom or a pre-K classroom, or if preschoolers are not commingled with other students in the cafeteria. So probably the majority of our schools, if they are serving pre-K students, they are not commingled and would be utilizing the CACFP meal pattern, which is in your handout, and we're going to be discussing that next. So next slide. So as we look at that meal pattern, we can see that it is based on the same required components as the school breakfast and as the school lunch program. So we have the same food components. At breakfast, we have 3 required components. And as we look across, we can see the required minimum portion sizes. And we can identify that those portion sizes are significantly less than the school breakfast and lunch program, much more in line with a pre-K student's needs. As we look at lunch, we can see that the requirement for fluid milk, the minimum requirement for ages 3 through 5 is 3/4 cup. And I can certainly serve more. So I can serve an 8-ounce container of milk, a carton of milk. But then as I look down, I can see again that the required portion sizes are significantly less. So let's move to the next slide. Well, there is one component that I want to point out for pre-K that is a little bit different when we compare it to the school lunch meal pattern, and that would be the meat alternate at lunch. Now, the daily requirement for pre-K ages 3 through 5 is 1.5 ounces. If we remember from yesterday, when we discussed what the meat alternate daily requirement at lunch is for our grades K through 8, it is 1 ounce. That's the daily requirement. Then we have our weekly requirements that we have to meet. And if we're planning menus for K through 8, that was the 9-ounce equivalent. So in pre-K meal pattern, we do not have a weekly requirement. We only have daily requirements. And that meat alternate requirement is 1.5 ounces per day. So if I am a school that has been cutting my sandwiches perhaps in half, and we'll go back to that cheeseburger on a bun, where it's contributing 2 ounces of meat alternate and 2 ounces of grain, and I've cut it in half. That would be 1 ounce of meat alternate and 1 ounce of grain. Am I meeting the daily requirement for our pre-K students? If I cut that sandwich in half and it is only contributing 1 ounce of meat alternate? The answer is no, because the daily requirement for those children for ages 3 through 5 is 1.5 ounces. So I would need to supplement that with an additional 1/2 ounce of meat alternate. Am I meeting the grain requirement if I cut that sandwich in half? Well, it's 1 ounce of grain equivalent, and my required daily portion size for lunch for grains is 1/2 ounce. So yes, I would be meeting the grain, but I would not be meeting the meat alternate. So wanted to point that out. That's something I see frequently on pre-K menus, is not understanding that it's 1.5 ounces of meat alternate daily for our pre-K students. So let's move to the next slide and talk about milk. For children 3 through 5 years of age, only unflavored 1% or skim milk is allowed. For pre-K students following the CACFP meal pattern, eating in the lunchroom, not commingled, or in the pre-K classroom, you cannot serve flavored milk. They can only have white 1% or skim milk. We're going to see a trend as we discuss the pre-K meal pattern. And the first one is no added sugar for milk. In the CACFP and the school meals pattern, water must be offered at meals. So the same requirement, they must have access to water during meal service. And that is plain water has to be offered. So no flavored or water with different things added to it. So we're talking plain water. Cups must be provided. Let's move to the meat alternate. Next slide. Tofu and yogurt, including soy yogurt, can be served in the CACFP meal pattern. Yogurt must contain no more than 15 grams of sugar per 4-ounce serving. So once again, we're seeing that trend of less sugar content for our pre-K students. 1/2 ounce of, or 1/2 cup of yogurt, which would be a 4 fluid ounce container, is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate. And overall, the meat alternate quantities credit the same as school lunch. So 1 ounce of cheese is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate. A large egg would be equivalent to 2 ounces of meat alternate. So the same crediting as what we saw in the school lunch meal pattern yesterday. Let's click to the next slide, and we'll talk about fruits and veggies. Fruits and vegetables are separate meal components, just like they are in the school lunch meal pattern. Separate components. For ages 3 through 5, the portion size is 1/4 cup of fruit and 1/4 cup of vegetable. A 1/2 cup vegetable may be served in place of the fruit, but must serve 2 different vegetables. So if I did not offer fruit, that I would need to offer an additional 4th cup of vegetable, and it has to be a different vegetable than the 4th cup I'm already offering. And yesterday I talked about how important it is to read footnotes on meal pattern charts. And once again, I'm going to emphasize that again with the preschool meal pattern chart, that a lot of information is found in the footnote section of this meal pattern as well. And then the final bullet on the slide is juice. Limited to serving once a day per child. So if I offer juice at breakfast, I cannot offer juice at lunch. Next slide, we're going to talk about grains. At least 1 serving per day must be whole grain rich. Breakfast cereals must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. And so that's our 3rd reference for this meal pattern of reduced sugar content. We've talked about the milk, we've talked about yogurt, and now we've talked about the breakfast cereals that can be offered for our pre-K students. And in your handout packet, there is additional information on sugar limits with yogurt, choosing breakfast cereals that are lower in added sugar. And we have the grain serving sizes for the CFP program. And there's additional footnotes on that grains chart that is specific to CACFP. And then another bullet on the slide is grain-based desserts not credible in CACFP. So grain-based desserts are not credible in that program, with the exception of muffins, quick breads, graham crackers, and animal crackers. So other dessert type items may not be served. So an example of that would be perhaps your pre-K eat in the cafeteria. They come in separate, so they are served the pre-K meal pattern. And on your regular menu for the other students that day, there is a cookie. Well, our pre-K students cannot have that cookie because dessert type items may not be served. So that would be our 4th restriction on the sugar content of the meals that are offered to pre-K students. So let's move to the next slide. Now, many pre-K programs offer a snack in the morning or a snack in the afternoon, or if you have a pre-K program operating at your school and they don't have access to breakfast or lunch, then perhaps maybe you are asked to provide a snack, an AM or a PM snack to those students. But those snacks served during the school day cannot be claimed for reimbursement. There is no snack program under the school meals pattern that allows for those types of snacks to be claimed for reimbursement. And they would be considered non-reimbursable snacks. Non-reimbursable snacks may need to follow the CACFP meal pattern for licensing requirements, but there are not any requirements under the school meals program. That would be a question to ask the pre-K program director if there are requirements for offering snacks. The preschool snack cannot be paid for out of the school meals account. The cost of providing those snacks must be billed to preschool or the general fund, and payment must be received back into the program for those non-reimbursable snacks. Let's move to the next slide. Other program considerations. Well, production records are required, and as Erica talked about, our newly revised production records, there is the first column on that production record is recording the portion sizes planned for pre-K, and total production would be included on the bottom of the record. You are required to keep the label information for those items that are specifically used for pre-K, just like any other label information. So that might include documentation of your yogurt label if you're serving yogurt to your pre-K, to demonstrate that it's meeting the lowered sugar requirements, the breakfast cereal served to pre-K, to also document that you're meeting the lower sugar content. So all of that does need to be recorded, and then the documentation to support meeting meal pattern must be on file. And then for food production, frying is not allowed in the pre-K meal pattern. Not that any of you are actually frying foods anyway, but this is specific to the CACFP pre-K meal pattern. Offer versus serve is not an option when utilizing the CACFP meal pattern. And then many of our pre-K programs are served in the classroom and are utilizing the family style meal service. And so we're going to be talking about what family style meal service entails. So let's move to the next slide. So with adult supervision, children are seated at tables and they serve themselves, just like in the picture on the slide, that each food component in sufficient quantity must be available for each child to select at least the minimum required portion size. So food is sent to the classroom, typically in bowls, and then the number of students that will be seated at a table times the required portion size. That's the quantity of food that is placed in the bowls or available to students. And then the food is passed around. A child may decline all foods as long as each food component is offered more than once. So the adult is present, encouraging the student to try the different food items, continuing to encourage during meal service the student to try the food items. So that is how family style meal service works, is that all food components are available on the table for the student. Typically the student is perhaps serving or pouring their own milk into cups, and they have plates in front of them, and the bowls or quantity of food is continually offered to the students, encouraging them to try new and different food items. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to be turning it over to Allie.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, we are on the last, headed towards the last section of today's training. So the following topics I'm going to cover in 1 to 2 slides. I'll give you a brief introduction of the topic. And then if you're interested in more information or more in-depth training, we will have this on our website. So just keep that in mind as we're going through the topics. So things we're going to cover today in this section are civil rights, special diets, professional standards, non-program foods and smart snacks, procurement and purchasing, and USDA foods. So starting with civil rights, knowledge of civil rights and equal treatment for all and the USDA non-discrimination statement must be included in program information. The full statement must be included in the student handbook at the end of this section that addresses the lunch program. The "And Justice for All" poster must be posted in the food service area and be visible to program participants. On menus, it can be a single sentence, USDA is an equal opportunity provider. Schools are also required to provide annual training for the food service staff on civil rights. This documentation of the training must be kept on file. Let's look at the next slide to see where you can find some resources on our webpage. So as you can see on our webpage, we have several resources. We have forms available to you for documenting your civil rights training, and we also have civil rights PowerPoints available for you that you can use to train your staff for this required training each year. When documenting the training, include the staff name, the position of the staff, the name of the training, and if receiving continuing education hours. Make sure to include the length of the training as your documentation. All of these items are needed and will be required if requested from our office. Moving on to special diets, Americans with Disabilities Act defines the meaning and interpretation of the term disability. The definition includes anything that affects a major life activity. These changes have made it easier for individuals to establish a disability. Most physical and mental impairments constitute a disability. It is important the food service staff is aware of the procedures for handling dietary requests. Food service must work with the households to best meet the nutritional needs of the student. Households must be informed of the process and procedure for requesting student meal accommodation requests. So on the next slide, we'll review the accommodations. For accommodations within the meal pattern requirement, a request form completed by the parent is acceptable and no medical statement is required. So an example of this would be Johnny is allergic to strawberries, but the SFA is able to offer different fruit whenever strawberries are menued, so the meal pattern is still met. For accommodations outside of the meal pattern, a request form needs to be completed by the parent along with a medical note signed by a licensed healthcare provider. So in this example, Abby has celiac disease and requires a gluten-free diet. A medical statement would be necessary, and the food service staff should work with the household to determine the appropriate accommodation. It should be noted that a gluten-free grain item should be available for the student to select. It is not allowed to ask the student to just not take the grain offering within offer versus serve. For lifestyle choices, consider offering menu options to accommodate. If utilizing offer versus serve, students can make choices. It is not required to make any changes. A student prefers not having an item offered. Also on our website, we have additional resources for you on special diets. We also have the forms included in your packet today. Things that are included on the website are additional forms and resources, and again, more training is available if you're interested. Jessica Formansky, another program specialist in our department, can help you with any questions that you have on special diets. She's also very familiar with the special diets and works in that area quite a bit. So if you have specific questions, she is a good one to reach out to, or any of us. Moving on to professional standards. There's a couple handouts in your packet on professional standards. So the first one we're looking at is the USDA hiring standards. There's a minimum for new school nutrition program directors on those hiring standards. On the slide, we see a snip of the USDA handout, and it shows the hiring standards table. Hiring standards include education and experience requirements. New food service directors must also be certified in food safety not more than 5 years prior to their starting date or within 30 days of their start date. This is mandatory that the new directors obtain the certification by completing one of the courses listed on the slide. FSAs must hire staff that meet these standards and supply documentation upon request. We also have Beth Haas listed on the screen. We have her email address. She is our expert in the food safety area. So if you have questions on these courses or on this section, you can also reach out to Beth or any of us. USDA Food and Nutrition Services requires professional standards educational training for school nutrition professionals. The rule requires a minimum amount of annual training hours for all school nutrition program directors, managers, and staff. Required training topic areas will vary according to position and job requirements. The NDE Professional Standards handout shown on the slide and in your packet has links to those trainings, and resources are also included on our webpage. Also included is a training tracker log that can be accessed in the links on our website or in your handout. Again, this is the log that you would use to track all your training. And a reminder that civil rights is required each year. Civil rights training is one of those trainings that must be done and included on that tracker. Moving on to non-program foods. Definition of a non-program food is any non-reimbursable food or beverage purchased using funds from the nonprofit food service account. This includes the sale of second entrees, milk, snacks, and adult meals. The food service program cannot financially support the sale of non-program food items and non-reimbursable meals. This means federal dollars cannot be used to support the sale of these items. Prices charged must be set high enough to recover all food costs. Nebraska's competitive food policy. This is food sold at schools during meal times, and the nonprofit school food service account does not receive the proceeds from these sales. These are considered in competition with the school meals program. This policy identifies when foods can be sold. Competitive food sales are prohibited from 1/2 hour before meal service until 1/2 hour after meal service. This applies to both breakfast and lunch. So let's say your school has a vending machine that's managed by the student council. It must be turned off during those times. Items sold as smart snacks are also considered to be non-program foods. The next 2 slides are pictures of handouts that are very useful when determining if an item meets smart snack guidelines. If your school does allow food and beverages to be sold during the day at times other than meal times, smart snack regulations specify what foods or beverages can be sold during the school day on the campus. Some definitions to help you understand: the school day is defined as midnight the night before until 30 minutes after the end of the school day. And the school campus is defined as all property under the jurisdiction of the school that are accessible to students during the school day. So if we go back to the student council vending machine, If they want to turn it on 1/2 hour after breakfast and lunch so they can sell during the day, the items in the machine must meet Smart Snack standards. So let's look at how to determine if the items are Smart Snack compliant. The Smart Snack decision chart has 2 pages, or a front and a back to it. The decision chart is shown here on the screen. It defines the standards for snacks as you see here, and beverages on the second side. You can see the snack must not exceed nutrient standards and additionally meet ingredient criteria. If you have a food item, look at the nutrition label and ingredient list on the item package, then use the chart to determine if it falls within the required limits. On the second page, the beverage guide goes into greater detail, listing beverages allowed at maximum sizes. This information is also presented by grade group. These handouts are guides to you to determine if an item meets Smart Snack standards and can be sold. In addition to the handouts, you can utilize the Smart Snack calculator on the Alliance for a Healthier Generation website. This calculator will ask you for some information on the product and then tell you if it meets the standards. By using these 2 tools, the handout, the chart, the decision chart, and this Smart Snack calculator, you can offer Smart Snack compliant items to be sold during the school day at your establishment. Moving on to procurement. So purchasing is simply the act of obtaining goods and services in exchange for money. Procurement is a multi-step approach to acquiring goods, supplies, and services at the best price. Your program receives federal and state dollars, so you are required to use free and open competition when making purchases. This means all vendors have the same opportunity to compete for your business. The Code of Conduct and Procurement Plan templates are included in your handout packet. Nutrition Services conducts procurement reviews. So in a review, we will ask to review your procurement plan, your code of ethics, and purchasing documentation you may have on hand, including invoices and receipts for purchases made from the nonprofit food service account. Moving on to Buy American provision. Buy American handout in your handout packet includes the Buy American provision and the Buy American justification form. The Buy American provision requires schools to purchase, to the maximum extent, domestic agricultural foods and products. This requirement is important because it supports the mission of the Child Nutrition Program, which is to serve children nutritious meals and support American agriculture. All food procurement transactions using funds from the nonprofit food service account must comply with the Buy American provision. You must keep documentation justifying the use of any exceptions due to price, availability, or domestic alternative substitutions. And new this year, you no longer need to complete the exception form for bananas, canned mandarin oranges, and pineapple. As we wrap up other topics, the last slide, we talk about USDA Foods Program. This is the program that includes your commodities, often referred to as brown box or sometimes F favors or DoD products. The information on this slide is also in your handout packet. This program is not administered by Nutrition Services, but is administered by Department of Health and Human Services. So on the slide and in your packet, we have contact information. There's a new director this year, Brian. Chad has now left the department. So the new director this year is listed on the screen, Brian, and he has an assistant, Matt. We have also listed the website to access the USDA foods, and that is listed on the screen. If you have questions or if you're new to the school meals program, we encourage you to reach out to those contacts to get signed up and get logins for your commodity information and ordering information. And up next, we are going to cover after school snack and special milk program. Also with these topics, we will give a brief overview, but there is additional training on our website, recorded training that goes into more detail about each of these programs. So the after school care snack program is an additional program that might be offered at your school. Eligible programs must include educational or enrichment activities in a supervised, structured environment. Operators must complete production records to obtain accurate point of service meal counts to support the claim for reimbursement. Also required are 2 on-site reviews that must be conducted each school year within the first 4 weeks of the program start. Food safety must be practiced and potable water must be accessible by students. Since this program is often served by others, you need to make sure it is administered correctly and the staff is trained properly. In your handout packet, you have an after-school snack meal pattern chart, and then you also have an after-school snack production record. So you can follow along on the meal pattern chart. For the after-school snack program, you must serve at least 2 different meal components in the required portion sizes of the following 4 components. For milk, it must be served 8 fluid ounces, 1 cup. For meat alternate, the requirement is 1 ounce equivalent. For grain, 1 ounce equivalent. And for fruit and vegetable or 100% juice is 3/4 cup. Offer versus serve is not allowed for this program. Students must take both food components. You must retain production records showing food components, portion size, and the amount of food needed for the number of snacks planned that day. Additional record-keeping resources, meal pattern charts, production records, and meal count forms can be found on our website under the after-school snack program. Additionally, you will find the after-school snack production records. As I mentioned, you have a production record in your handout along with a completed production record to give you an example of what all needs to be listed on that information. The special milk program provides reimbursement for milk served to children in schools, child care institutions, and eligible camps that do not participate in other U.S. Department of Ag child nutrition programs. Schools in the National School Lunch Program or School Breakfast Program may also participate in the special milk program to provide milk to children in half-day, pre-kindergarten, or kindergarten programs where the children do not have access to the USDA School Meals Program. School milk program sponsors are reimbursed for the milk served to students in half-pint increments. There is no federal requirement to offer milk at no charge. Pricing is based on the options selected by the sponsor. There are 3 different pricing options including price with free milk option, pricing without free milk option, and non-pricing. School systems may apply to participate in the special milks program if they have students in the school who, again, do not have access to the school meals program. For example, half-day kindergartners or preschoolers or students in school that cannot participate in breakfast or lunch. Only pasteurized fluid milks of fat-free and low-fat 1% milk can be served. These milks must meet all state and local standards. And our last slide, we have a reference to the Institute of Child Nutrition. Chef Sharon is listed on there, and she has a wonderful back to school toolbox available. We found this resource really helpful for those of you who might be new or might need some ways to organize your back to school lists on things that need to be done. So be sure to download the checklist. It's a wonderful resource and it can help you get started on the right foot this year.